Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I am the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How is everyone? How is everyone doing? I don't know. What do you even say anymore? It's just interesting that every week it's just the slow decline. Just a couple more things where you're like, that's not coming back again in my lifetime. I have a question, though. Were the Nazis this laughably dumb? Like, everyone that's in the government at the moment is maybe one of the stupidest people I've ever encountered in my life. Encountered in quotes. Stupid, grotesque, gargoyle-looking. Like, were people in 1930s Germany making fun of Goebbels for looking like a Nosferatu? For having a giant forehead? The same way that I'll make fun of Stephen Miller for looking like Gollum? Or did the Nazis have some kind of air of propriety around their vulgar violence? I don't know. It's a good question. What's the answer? I don't know what the answer is to that, but I'll tell you what the answer is to what to do if you're feeling blue, and that's listen to today's episode, which is what you're doing right now, because today's guest is Mr. Fish. And if you don't know who he is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. For over 20 years, cartoonist Dwayne Booth, a.k.a. Mr. Fish, has been creating political cartoons for publications like Harper's Magazine, TruthDig.com, the Los Angeles Times, The Village Voice, Vanity Fair, Mother Jones, The Advocate, and many, many others. In addition, he was an animated character designer for Bento Box Entertainment. They're the folks that make Bob's Burgers. And is the subject of a 2017 award-winning documentary by Pablo Bryant called Mr. Fish, Cartooning from the Deep End. His books and collections include Go Fish, How to Win Contempt and Influence People. It's a great book. Warning, graphic content, and Then the World Blew Up. Long Story Short, Turning Famous Books into Cartoons, and his most recent, Nobody Left, which was published by Fantagraphics. I recommend them all. I've been a fan of Dwayne's for a while now. I don't know if this is how I found out about him, but so I don't know like how far back this goes, but he makes cartoons that accompany a lot of Chris Hedges' essays. By the way, Chris Hedges, former guest on the show. Check out that episode. And along with Ellie Valley, Dwayne is doing some of the most incisive and, I was going to say funny. It is funny, but it's more like wryly funny. More like accompanied by a deep, depressive sigh. But some of the most incisive comic work of the 21st century. By the way, Ellie Valley, former guest on the show as well. Anyway, this was a delight. Didn't know what to expect. You know, whenever I talk to someone who's not a comedian, I'm always going into it assuming, even if they write or make funny stuff, if they're not speaking comedically for a living, I'm never sure what to expect. But Dwayne, talkative, playful, compelling. So I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed talking to Dwayne. Before we get into it, just want to say, coming up on the show, a lot of cool talks. We've got Kelly, speaking of comics, Kelly Sue DeConnick, fantastic writer, Michael DeForge from the world of indie comics. Those are both very cool. Some great talks with musicians, Tune Yards, David Bazan of Pedro the Lion, the Irish band Mail. Really cool talk. So stay tuned for those, but for now, let's talk to Dwayne. Back to what we were saying just minutes ago before I hit the record button.
Yeah.
You were saying it's a physiology thing. Feeling good in California matches your physiology, which is what I think about. I am a very cerebral, I say that almost like with a retching sound as I say, cerebral person. Like I don't, I don't sit there and do the New York Times crossword puzzle on Sundays. Like I don't mean like that. I just mean that like I live in my head most of the time, and like my body seems like an afterthought. And so it took me a long time, especially like took me into to performing for a living in some way, to like realize like, oh no, this is like most of it's body stuff, most of it's energy, most of it's that. And I'm
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
wondering if you came to that conclusion sooner as someone who works in visual art, because your craft is you have to kind of like have an intuitive feel, I assume, of your body.
This is getting very sensual really fast.
That's hey, and if anyone knows me, they know I am one of the most sensual people in the world. So this tracks exactly.
Perfect. Yeah, you know what? I don't even know. But there's something about the light in California, and there's something about the space in California, and the fact that most of your life is being lived outside.
Hmm.
And if you can curate your space when you live back east, then you've created your home. As you could probably see if I turned my laptop around, I'm surrounded by 1,000 books and records and a mummy model and all sorts of things that, this is who I am. You surround yourself with the things that you want to reflect back on what you think makes you cool.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So, but for me, when I moved to California, I was outside most of the time. And so it made me rely a lot on life outside to help determine what my level of coolness was, which means I had to participate with the world, and not just the people and not the stuff that I was doing, but there is a real strong nature element to California.
Yeah. Wait, when did you move here? When we were talking, you mentioned the word blockbuster, so I'm assuming sometime in the 90s into the 2000s.
You are exactly right. Yeah, I moved out there in 97
Okay.
and then I moved back east in 2009.
And then were you someone who was in touch with, again, this is going to get sensual, and did you recognize, how about this is a better way to phrase this, did you recognize you had a body? Because when I first read Descartes' Meditations, and then I read about the like brain in the jar, which is like the modern updating of the demon that separates the mind from the body, right? The whole thing, the brain in the jar. I was like, that feels right. That I recognize that. That's good. And I don't like having a body. And I've eventually, like I said, had to recognize that there is no such thing as a mind body duality. It's all one thing in some way. Were you,
Right,
before you moved here, were
yeah.
you someone who recognized that you had a body, and California just, I was going to say, exacerbated that feeling? Or in moving here, did you start to become human? I guess.
Yeah, it's so funny because as you were explaining all of that, I think that it's even more base than what how you're talking about it. It just in the sense that I've always been somebody who has entered into a space uh, with attempting some sort of balance between my heart and my head.
Hmm.
Because inside my family, so much of how we interact with each other is trying to figure out the most inappropriate, funny thing to say at any given moment, right? So if that's how one is raised, one is a little more open, is listening more than attempting to control the narrative through a sheer force of nature or will. So a lot of it is listening to know when you're going to pronounce yourself in some meaningful or interesting way. So moving to California, since I had no family out there, all of a sudden I had to. I was the only person in the room, and then essentially it was just like, how do I surprise, inspire myself?
Hmm.
How do I shock myself? You know,
Was it that conscious, that thought? Was it that like, how do I do this? Or was it kind of just you were
it was,
missing that feeling and so you
yeah,
started?
it was intuitive. I mean, it was an intuitive thing. And I wouldn't say it was a survival mechanism. I mean, I've always been a generally optimistic and happy person. So when I got out there, it was, again, it was just an opportunity for me to spend some serious time with my own mind, because I didn't have the distraction of lots of family around me or even really close friends to inhabit my space with me. It was just my wife and I.
and you enjoy dealing with your own mind. And I say that as someone who spends a lot of time distracting himself from his own mind so that we don't spiral into darkness.
It's a yeah, no. It's a good question, and it's actually one that I thought about when I was probably, I'm going to guess, I think it was probably around 10. And I realized, as somebody who always, have always been doing art. And so I've always had the company of my own mind to sustain a kind of meditation through the execution of art, which tends to take some time. So if you can't stand the company of your own mind, you're you're in the wrong, profession or vocation. So I've always been okay with that aspect of it. But I do remember hearing some siblings and some friends even saying at some point or another how bored they were. And I saw that as sort of immature, with people who were my age. But then I heard grown-ups saying it. And I remember when I was 10 years old, I just remember having this real strong moment where I was like, oh my gosh, I do not want to grow up and face the trauma of all of a sudden being stranded at the side of the road, needing to find a phone booth when there were phone booths. And I imagined it's just like, what if the phone booth was 5 miles away and I was stranded at the side of a road that had no trees, that was just a desolate patch of highway? How will I sustain myself on that walk to get to the phone booth without driving myself mad? And I remember, again, I was 10 years old and I was just like, I've got so many things that I would like to figure out and so many things that I want to think about and shock myself with, because this also corresponded with a time when I was very agnostic about the existence of a God. And I always thought it was very depressing to think that if there was this omniscient consciousness that had the ability to constantly eavesdrop on me and read my mind, that I didn't like. So I wanted to figure it out early. If this is true, I don't like it. If it's not true, I want to ignore it. So what do? Let me test the creator by thinking of the most obscene things that I can possibly think of. And see if I'm going to be punished, because I didn't want to go through life with the equivalent of just like this deity with like a piano wire or something, just always behind me, ready to just like, end my dirty thoughts or my inappropriate thinking. And it's funny because this stuff, I couldn't think of anything that was appropriately offensive enough, apparently, to, have God punish me. But then again, I wasn't very creative back then. So I might have to revisit that.
Wait, that seems like a very Catholic thought to me. And I say that as a Jew, so I don't exactly. I have Catholic friends, or did. I don't know if anyone outside of JD Vance is Catholic now. But do you know what I mean? Like that for some reason, the idea that like God is eavesdropping on me.
It wasn't a thing. And it trust me, it didn't occur to me as somebody who was tortured because I was a believer and that it was bothering me. This was a stage in my life when it's the same time when I asked my mother if I could give people my ring finger instead of the middle finger. Because I'm just like, they're just fingers. If somebody's going to be offended by one finger over another, then that's bullshit. Who cares? That's their problem, Yeah. Yeah. So it was all of that stuff. It was just, it was testing what grownups were, peddling as morality, right and wrong, proper behavior, things that we should or shouldn't do. And again, just getting back to my family none of that. There was none of that inside my family. There was never any expectation or pressure to honor anybody in the family just for the fact that they were my mother or my father, and that's a whole story we might be able to, get into at some point. I didn't know who my real father was literally until I moved back actually out of California in 2009, but we'll get around to that. Like all of those titles were just like it was just meaningless, you know. And there was a general disgust and disdain for politics, people who were like presidents, people who were popes or bishops or reverends or anything like that. It was always about you need to demonstrate some sort of behavior to invite my respect and my appreciation for you. You're not going to do it with a title.
Wait, where did that come from in your family? Because I was taught to fear authority when I was growing up. And then it took me until reading Chomsky, and Chomsky was just like, if someone's an authority, they have to prove to you that it's worth it. Otherwise, why do it? I'm just like, wait, I could just say no? Hold on.
Yeah.
I'm allowed to, you know, and I would goof off up to a certain point where, you know, if I knew that it was okay to goof off, if like, because I was a good student. So if I knew that the teacher, if I was doing well in that class, I could fuck around in class because the teacher would be like, oh, Andy, you know, that kind of thing.
Right.
But like any authority where like it actually had control over me, I was terrified of, you know, and still there's lingering. You know, there was a cop behind me on the 101, and I was just like, better just go 55. What if I go 56 and the guy is going to be an ass or something like that?
Yeah, right. Nothing to see here, officer. And it's funny because I was a terrible student. Because for that reason, you know, I remember in kindergarten, no, probably first grade. I remember we took a little quiz, and it was at the end of the day, and then the teacher gathered the quizzes, and then she sat down at her desk, and she's like, okay, you know, just your buses, you'll be called for dismissal soon, you know, so just, you know, be quiet and behave yourselves. And I saw her take out a book that she opened that had all of the right answers, and then she set it against the tests that she had taken. And to me, that was just like, oh my God, this is a cheat. You're cheating, you know? So it's just like, oh, you don't know either. You know, you can't look at the work that we did and said, that's sort of, and all of a sudden it was just like, that's not even teaching. So I was just like, oh, what a hoax. It's all a freaking hoax. So again, just going back to what my family was like, if everybody in the family is trying to surprise everybody else in the family with humor, humor asks for a radical reinterpretation of all the things that are serious.
Yeah. Okay. So then,
yes,
in your family, where does that come from? Like, was that just the chemistry that was there from this is going to be a strange way of putting this, but the orientation of the human beings. So I feel like I'm an alien saying this, but I just mean that like in some, like the chemistry that's generated by a group of people sometimes does that in a way that, you know, if it had been a different assemblage of humans, again, I feel like an alien, then it would have been a different, like it would have been a different vibe. How's that? That's an easy way.
No, it's a great question. And it's all the players, you know, it's sort of how we're wired. And just the way you were describing it, I just started to think, I'm just like, wow, yeah. I mean, I guess it's a more benign form of prejudice that is hard baked into the family that just makes, you know, in another circumstance, we would all be virulent Klansmen or something. You know, this is what we believe, you know?
Yeah, we're transgressive against equality.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I guess being a Klans person is another way of saying F you to authority, but, you know.
There's the pull quote.
Yeah, so it was really in the family, and it still is. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's trade-offs. It's not... When you have a family like that, like when I met my wife, it shocked her that she saw that nobody ever even asked the most simple question of just like, hey, how are you? You know, or just anything like that. So even in a way, a lot of my growing up, and even entering into my early adulthood, I wasn't even sure that my parents knew what I did. I mean, they knew that I liked to draw. They knew that I was getting published as, you know, an insufferable know-it-all that likes to piss people off. They knew that. But as far as just like, you know, this is, I don't know. They would never ask the questions that you're asking. So a lot of the interaction is assumptions of goodwill and appreciation of trusting that the other people will get the joke, like being challenged, and that's the love language that exists.
Did you want their approval though? Or were
No.
you're totally fine without it?
It never occurred to me. That's like, again, like my wife would ask these questions because this, I can talk about now if you'd like, the fact that I didn't know who my father was. Like there's certain questions just would never come up. Like, for example, the father piece. My brother and I've got an older brother, I've got a younger brother, I've got a younger sister, and I got a twin sister. And so growing up, my brother, my older brother, he looks nothing like me. His even mannerisms are everything is different between me and my brother Jeff, except for the sense of humor piece, of course. And all the conversation had to do with this person, James Booth, who was supposed to be my father and my twin sister's father, and my older brother's father. But there was no interaction. We never saw him, and we never even knew to ask where he was. Right? It was just never a thing inside the family. We didn't, nothing was being repressed. It was just, who cares, So I had a stepfather who was not, we called him Dave. I didn't even call him Dad, So it wasn't even like a thing like, this is the father figure and this is my father. No, it's Dave. And this is what I expect from Dave. And so as we grew up and as we kept going on and on and on, right before I moved out from California back east, my older brother called me. And this was when my mother had died and my uncle was still alive. My both grandparents are dead at this point. And I would talk to my brother all the time, almost every day. He and I would do music together, and he and I have just gotten very close. We're very simpatico as just human beings. So he called to check in to see how the move was going, and he normal conversation. I said, all right, I'll see you around. I'll see you. And he goes, oh, wait a minute. There was something else. And what was it? And he says, oh, I was talking to Roger, who's my uncle. And he said that Big Paul has throat cancer. Now, Big Paul was somebody that I do remember from my childhood. My grandmother had the type of house on the block here in Pennsylvania that everybody knew Mrs. Taylor. And so growing up, all of my uncle's friends and all of my mother's friends were in and out of the house constantly. And they all had nicknames. Frog Ass Franny was one of them, and Big Paul was another one. So Big Paul was just this really a sweet guy who would come over, and he had giant feet, Big Paul. And I hadn't heard of Big Paul in, a while. We keep somewhat tabs on some of these older people, from our childhood. And so, my response was like, oh, wow. Well, I guess that's sort of sad. And he said, yeah, but there was something else that Roger told me about that. He said, oh, let's see. He said that he's your dad. He's your real dad.
Just offhandedly.
Yeah. Which is great. I mean, again, this is an example of how, the humor plays in the family. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. And I told Roger, I'm like, I don't think Dwayne knows that. And Roger said, oh, he knows that. And I said, yeah, no, I never knew that. And he said, well, you must be pretty excited by that news. I'm like, what specifically about that news do you think I'd be excited by? And he said, well, he's dying of throat cancer. I'm like, well, what's that have to do with anything? He says, so I know you're such a huge Star Wars fan, so it's just you coming back, maybe walking into the room where Big Paul is and hearing him get to say, yeah, you are my son, So that's what and then of course, for the next week when I would call him, he would answer the phone when he would see it was me and say, hey, little Paulie. And so, so that's how I found out who my real dad was. And so, of course, I called my twin sister and I told her, and she, again, just everything is very deadpan in my family. She was like, oh, are we supposed to go see him now? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know if we're going to go, supposed to see him now. And so he actually, maybe 2 weeks later is when I finally got back to the East Coast, and he had just died. So I didn't get to, and my wife was just like, well, you going to talk to the widow or anything? And I'm like, I don't know if I don't know anything about this. What if the widow doesn't even know I exist? And apparently I looked just like him. And that was the weird thing too, because my mother collected all of her high school yearbooks, from when she was in middle school up until she graduated. So she had everybody's. And my real father had graduated a year before her. So his face I'd been looking at all my childhood because I used to love to go through those books.
So, okay, there's a lot here from the like casualness, the like basically the same kind of tone that someone would tell you, like hey, you can get double mozzarella sticks at Red Robin now if you just have to know how to order correctly. With like, right. By the way, that's a true thing. If you order, you get the
sponsorship. Here we go.
Look, I don't care about anything else at Red Robin. I think they have good mozzarella sticks. And if you order the appetizer sampler, you can just get double mozzarella sticks instead of whatever the other things are. That's just a tip. I haven't been in a Red Robin in like 5 years. Anyway, but the casualness of that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
From there to the, like, I guess the first thing that popped into my head was like, was this ever a question mark? I've talked to a lot of people where like there have been questions about parentage and it's hung over their heads for their entire life, or it's been something that they've had to solve. It seems like for you, it was just like, whatever. Is that true?
It was because I couldn't really bring anything to it, because it was, the practicality of it just being how it is. That stuff doesn't haunt me. Now, I'll say I say that about the discovery and then coming back and then him being dead and all of that stuff. And then I had kids. And that made it slightly different because all of a sudden it occurred to me when I finally had to go down and clean out the house that I grew up in, and I got to gather all of those books, all of those yearbooks and so forth. And I remember I was coming back to my house here in Pennsylvania. The house was in New Jersey where I gathered all this stuff. All of a sudden, there was this weird feeling from the back of the car, that my father, who's inside these pages, all of a sudden I started to have these questions about how was he not curious about me? Why did he not reveal himself to me? And I asked that because, like I had said earlier, he had been in and out of the house when I was growing up. His mother lived 3 doors down from my grandmother. So it was just like, oh my gosh, my grandmother lived 3 doors down from the grandmother that I knew was my grandmother. And that's when it started to haunt me a little bit, because I have such love for my children that I cannot imagine being able to ignore the fact that I am connected to offspring in a way that would allow me to be silent. And I did. I came into the house and I was moving through the house, and then I did have a moment where I went into my wife and I was talking to her, and I got choked up, and all of a sudden for a moment I couldn't speak because I was all of a sudden so overcome of just like, how could he have not cared enough to actually say something, put his arm around my shoulder or something, because I don't have any memory of that. So that's when it became real, when I had my kids, and it all of a sudden meant something completely different. But it was fleeting.
Are you able in general to shake off that kind of stuff?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I get to experience, and it's there's a richness there, and there's a great satisfaction in being able to feel such a deep emotion. But I don't need to hold on to it or use it to wound myself or anything like that. At the same time, I'm not pushing it away. I try to be in the flow with everything. I try to live circumstantially. I try to live present-centeredly as much as I can, because I feel like if you lose yourself in thinking by reflecting on things or anticipating too much, you're existing outside the moment, and that's not an authentic way to exist.
Yeah, you're right. It sucks.
Yeah.
as my primary mode of being, it's not the greatest, and I look for those, and they're mostly artistic experiences where I can be in the flow of the moment. Or,
Right.
there's also like times just like hanging out with my wife or friends or something like that where I can genuinely experience life and not have to think about, again, the darkness that sits outside of that
Yeah,
immediate
yeah.
experience.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Was that a struggle to get to that point, or is that kind of your natural state?
It's my natural state. And I think now we can even I'll take you up on this challenge, which feels a little bit like a challenge. I think I can say perhaps one of the reasons why that is the case is that there is also a certain amount of tragedy inside of my family. Like my uncle, for example, when he was 2, fell out of a 2-story window and landed on his head.
Oh,
So he had to take medication for his whole life for seizures. And this he fell out the window when my grandfather was just about ready to come home from the war. So it was my grandmother all by herself. And so my grandmother always had like this real anxiety when it came to just hearing sirens,
yeah, sure.
things like that. Like that stuff's in. So there's this feeling, and again, like not knowing who my father was. What that came out of a trauma from with my mother, and I've only been able to piece together some of that narrative over time, just talking to people. But my Jeff's father was abusive, so that's why my mother left him. And my father, Paul, was just a great friend that they ended up hooking up one night. And again, I don't know if she even told him for sure that, she had had his twins. So there's all this sort of stuff that I wouldn't say that it's necessarily shame induced, this producing of this freewheeling type of just like, hey, everything, let it be how it's going to be type of attitude. But I'm sure that is hard baked into some of the genetics of the family. But at the same time, it's all been normalized, you know. So the fact that it's normalized, I think, makes sort of just like I was saying about nobody, even when I was growing up, and I could always draw very well. And I entered into it early enough. I don't remember having that feeling of just like, wow, I wish I could draw a horse. I'm going to teach myself how to draw a horse. It was just part of my, wow, this is fun. I'm just doing stuff, making shit up, and blah, 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 blah. So, and there was nobody in my family that looked at it ever and said, wow, that's really amazing. And which is great, because I think as soon as somebody starts to say that is unique, I think it can tighten some people up to sort of become sort of just like, how am I going to keep doing this? And where's the expertise? Now I have to compare myself to other people's version of expertise and see if I can match it, or even outdo it, all of that sort of stuff. None of that stuff ever crossed my mind, again, because of the form of communication that we had, did not dwell on upset. It was more a celebration of the here and now, and let's make it as nice as possible and fun, as cool as possible. But there are some things that get lost in that, obviously. But my discovery of what those things did not provide for me have been just a series of wonderful discoveries, which I hope for everybody as you move through life. You never get to the point where you're just like, all right, well, I've figured out enough to have a meaningful life. So now I'm just going to, elbow other curiosities that come my way because, I'm fine. I form myself at the moment when I stop thinking about things that I should be thinking about. I never want to stunt myself like that. And that's one of the things that is also important in the family.
Yeah. I mean, I'm obsessed. I've been obsessed with that for a long time about how do I live a creative life where I'm constantly, where like I look at people who, as a parenthetical, I look at people who like in their 70s are making the worst art in the world. And I'm just like, what happened to, like, you were vibrant in your 30s? What happened in the intervening 40 years where you're now churning out dreck? And how do I avoid that? That's been, I've come.
Are you talking about George W. Bush? Are you talking about George W. Bush, who
oh yeah,
all of a sudden
great.
Started doing those paintings right after?
In his 30s. the kind of stuff he was doing, whether it was drunk driving or executing people in Texas. That was
Right.
was the real, that was like his
Yep.
early Neil Young albums. And then the paintings, I'm just like, oh boy,
Yeah, man. You
thumbs
used to be
down.
cool when you were dismantling democracy and,
Yeah. Remember the War on Terror? I mean, even that was like a little bit on the downside, but still we were like,
yeah.
when we were
We all were watching. Yes.
so so I hear what you're saying. And that's, I think, going back to when I asked that insane alien like question about the configuration of the people. Because I guess the way I was thinking about it was, it could either be a kind of very Freudian thing that happened, and a kind of dialectical way that your family was, like the way your mom and your stepdad were raised, and then how that affected you, or could just be the chemistry of the people, or obviously there's it's a spectrum between those two things, but
Yeah.
the chemistry of your family together and the time and place that allowed you to kind of just be in this bubble, which is a very common thing on the show, is that someone was allowed to be in a bubble and become themselves. And then that
Yeah.
allows them to not follow the script that everyone else was following, to
Yeah.
become, and no shade to someone who's an actuary, but to become an actuary.
Yeah. No, 100%. I mean, one way to look at it is, and you can ask this of other artists, or just any thinkers, when you're trying to figure stuff out, you're in a private space when you're trying to do it, right? I mean, it's just a general rule. It's to maximize contemplation, deliberation. You look for a private space, right? So once you're in these private spaces, and if you're an artist who's trying to figure out, the parameters of why life is worth living, what is bullshit, what is truth, it's very hard to believe bullshit when you're sitting alone and you're really focusing on it, because so much of bullshit finds its agency comes from the fact that it's being expressed in a public space where everybody has been convinced that they have to believe that the bullshit, or pretend that the bullshit, is viable.
Yeah.
And there's 1,000 different examples of that. Even just like it, and it's built into our technologies. I love whenever I try to type motherfucker into my phone or something, and it has all the suggestions. It always is just like, I have no idea. I don't know. What do you do? I don't know what you're trying to say here. But we all know that, the vernacular of just living a life is different from how you're supposed to comport yourself in a public space. Right. So if you recognize that, and then you learn to see why that is profound and necessary, and reflects what you want to do with your life, this feels fun. This feels like real life. It's not performative. It's not theater like so much of your life outside in the public spaces. So depending on what your personality is, some people are just like, well, fuck it. I really want to live. I'm not an actor. I'm not somebody who wants to figure out how to pretend and then be rewarded by something as meaningless as income and respect based on these, the codification of bullshit pretending over, expressing an authentic life. And if you can get into a profession where all of a sudden you make that what your communication is, then you're lucky. And you end up living a life that all of a sudden you don't feel like you have a job. I don't, it's because I don't feel like the work that I'm doing is work. It just feels like it's what I do. And you could say the same thing. You mentioned Noam Chomsky, who I got the great joy of interviewing at one point. And it was, you can see it's coming out. It's him too. He's genuine. He's so curious, that this is what I would be doing if I even wasn't getting paid for it. That's what you have to ask yourself. Would I still be doing this if I wasn't earning an income? And if I could self-sustain somehow, is this still the same thing that I would be doing?
Yeah. Do you remember, I don't know about the first time, but an early time when you realized that the rules that people follow are just contingent and they're not handed down by some kind of either deity or just that like the way things are is not the way they have to be.
Yeah. Again, like all being curious as a little kid, and I think all little kids are like this. You ask so many questions about why something is like this, a certain way. And if you even search your memory from when you were a child, you'll start to realize that there's no good answers. You remember those. I just remember those frustrations of just like, oh, for God's sakes, that's your best response to what I was just asking. And I remember even being in Sunday school. My parents would drop us off at Sunday school so they could go food shopping for the week. Right? It's the only reason we were in there. And I remember thinking, again, I'm just like, okay, so let me see if I can figure this out. Because I could never figure out religious stories as being true, Jonah and the whale and all that. Oh, and he was crucified. And guess what? He came back. I'm just like, I don't understand how that is possible, right? And I do remember at the end of one of the last times I was in Sunday school, I remember thinking that I figured it out. And my solution to the whole problem to have it make sense was, oh, Santa Claus. All right, so Santa Claus is Jesus as an old man. And I'm like, if I can get the teacher to say, that is 100% true. Then I'm like, okay, I actually understand Santa. So if I can tie that into sort of like, religious dogma and try to see how these things can coexist, then maybe I can start to figure stuff out. And I remember asking the question, and the teacher just, I might as well have slapped her with something. She was just offended by the question. Again, because she knew that God was listening to the telepathy of the room, so she knew that there was going to be. But it was stuff like that, that made me just not trust, because I knew plenty of idiotic adults, I guess. You know what I mean? Where you're raised to think that children should be quiet, obedient. They have things to learn from grown-ups, and I saw something different, because mind you, I remember the 70s, and I remember what was going on at that time. You had the feminization of society. You had Black Power that was exerting itself as not only part of a revolutionary movement, but part of like a normalization inside of society. And there was pushback. I knew that there were elements inside the dominant culture that didn't like that. And my best friend was Black. And I had a twin sister, so all these things, I'm just like, I don't know what fiction you're allowing yourself to be, drawn by the nose around.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was just always that suspicion, and then always trying to test it again with the mechanism of humor and also just being blunt about what you think about, because that's probably it's if my favorite kind of humor is the kind that are largely blunt truth telling,
Yeah. Okay. This is what I find interesting though. And I use myself kind of as this base to kind of like figure out my guess, but like I think I'm a little younger, but growing up in Reagan's America,
right.
I was like, this is all stupid. And I knew everything was stupid. I knew plenty of stupid adults. Yeah. But I was still terrified that they had power over me. I think that's the
right.
thing that is setting you apart, where I'm curious about, because I'm like, you were not terrified. Like I recognized all the same things you did. Yeah. And I feel like in the 80s, it was even more pronounced, like how dumb culture had gotten.
Yeah.
And even as a
100%.
child, I knew like this is stupid. Why my cousin who I love, who is gay, why is society, and my family doesn't have a problem with it, but why am I getting all these cues from society that it's bad? Or why is the word gay pejorative? Like, what is going on? Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's stupid.
Yeah, I was just lucky enough again to have people who I could push back against and ask any inappropriate question to inside of my family who were grown-ups. And they were, if there was any semblance of an authority figure that I was going to listened to. It was inside the family. And the authority was not exerted, it wasn't an externality, that they held in front of them like a shield. It was something that I actually sought wisdom from. So, I think that that's probably one of the differences. And like I said, hating school and seeing it as something, I never cared about grades, literally until I was a junior in high school, when it was just like, well, it might look better if you're trying to go to college if you don't, have just really low grades. And it's not because I was an imbecile or anything. I just had no patience for it.
Yes.
I just didn't. Yeah, I was self-directed when it came to. I figured out early. We only learn what we teach ourselves. So what am I going to do if that is the truism? Then how do I proceed? Well, I'm very curious about a lot of things, so I'm going to try to teach myself a lot of things. I'm not going to trust an institution of learning to do that necessarily. It depends on the teachers too. I mean, I had some good teachers. My art teacher from high school, I'm still in contact with. He lives in Florida, and I wrote a book on art history and dedicated it to him. And again, I'm a college dropout. I went to college for art, and then saw the same sort of rut inside of the university because I was so good at rendering things. I could make anything, and I would always get an A plus. And then I started to just be like, I'm feeling no pushback or challenge here. So then I started to deliberately ignore what the prompts were for the assignments, and then create my own. And I still got A pluses.
Yeah.
I'm like, why do I need to be in college for this?
Yeah. Yeah. That's I think that's the thing where once I started to do my own thing, and I would still get rewarded for it, at least in some cases, but in school, I was like, this tension developed in me where I'm like, I've been told I'm supposed to follow, if I want a good life, I'm supposed to follow the rules and do well. And it's all going to go on my permanent record. But most of that stuff is stupid. Yeah, and I can recognize it's stupid. And when I do my own thing, I get rewarded for it in many cases if the teacher is decent. And that contradiction took until my late 20s to work out.
Right. Yeah. Well, you're indoctrinated. I mean, the indoctrination on all of this is so intense.
Yeah.
Because it suggests that any attempt at courageous behavior to sort of find out what you really think and feel about things, there are just penalties for it. You're not participating in the right way. You're a disruption. And you're a writer. That one of the things that you want to do with your work is be a version of a disruptor. You want to create something that's going to be surprising, that it's going to be a reconsideration of something. So somebody is going to be wowed by it, or enlightened somehow, or just even basically entertained. That's what we look for. We look for things that are surprises in life. If it's just sitting and it's, stationary and predictable, that's the other piece. So much of this indoctrination in school, in jobs, in life, is attempting to make everything predictable. So our anxiety is not heightened by, the potentiality of being shocked unnecessarily.
Yeah.
Right. When really life is really made up. It only vibrates and is visible to us if it is a concoction of surprises. That's a delight. I want to wake up not knowing what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's 100% why I am doing this. It took a while for me to get there, but it's just like I had this vision in my head when I was younger. And it's still every once in a while it'll pop in there as a kind of boogeyman, but of me as an adult sitting in a ratty recliner, eating a lean cuisine, watching reruns of Seinfeld, whatever, right? Some sitcom. And that was my adult life. And that haunted me of that. And every day, there's a routine to my day. It's not like, my wife doesn't drive, so I drive her to the Universal Studios, and then I, come home and the dog has to go out. There's stuff that has to happen, but there's no set thing, right?
Right.
Every day there's some kind of something new, something novel that makes it not a drag. And I, the idea that when I did have that in my life, when I did, working like some shitty day job or something like that, it was death. It felt like death.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And before I was able to sustain myself as an artist, that was my routine. Just shitty job after shitty job. And you try to find a job where you can then create friendships inside of that job. There's always going to be community inside of even the
Sure.
shittiest jobs. So those are the things that's what I started to focus on. Like, this is a hangout opportunity.
Yeah.
And then you do it for a while, and then I would save up enough money and then take 6 months off, and then all of a sudden need to get another shitty job.
Yeah.
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 And again, even that anxiety and that pain is sort of something I can get sentimental about, now.
Sure. I have my stories about, moving to New York and, having to sell my guitar to pay for rent 1 month and, all that kind of stuff. Like, I have those. At the time, I don't remember it being fun. I don't remember the nice guitar that I had gotten, having to take it apart and mail it to someone who bought it on eBay, and then all I had left was the shitty Stratocaster knockoff that my parents got me when I was 15 from the thrift store. Like, that, like, I don't remember that being particularly fun, but now I'm just like, I paid my dues, like that.
Yeah.
I am curious though, what economic class did you grow up in?
Probably just above. We were very low middle class. And there were times when, growing up, there was always talk that we were going to lose the house. There were several years when we got food from the church, like a couple years where I was drinking powdered milk, and I developed a taste for it, actually. So it was, there was that aspect of just, again, and even the suffering that my family was going through with that, the fact that my stepfather was a part-time bartender for a while, then he delivered appliances, and he had his own pain. He was an alcoholic as well. So he was going through his stuff, but there was always this feeling inside the family, like with my mother and so forth, that just like, man, the system is rigged against any sort of humanitarian, recognition of human beings. Fuck them. So it was always this place where it was just like, okay, we're going to feel a little bit under the boot always because they're assholes. And look, we're not assholes, even though we're under the boot, here's a dick joke that everybody's going to love, stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah. It's just funny how these things play out where my parents, I think, had this kind of just like, well, just life is suffering. That's just it. That's just the way it is. And I think it's probably, their parents, my grandparents, I think were either born here when they were very young or immigrated here from Eastern Europe. This is pre-World War II. They were born in my grandfather fought in World War II. They were born in the wake of the Holocaust. So there's all this kind of just like, well, yeah, life is suffering. You just, you do what you have to do and you take care of your family. Like the good part is family, right? But everything else is just like suffering. You deal with it. And I don't know if it's just my generation or what, but like I had to crawl out from under that and be like, well, no, life can be fun too. Life doesn't have to be suffering. There is suffering, but that doesn't mean that's the sum total of everything. And you just have to like find the nooks and crannies where you can find a little bit of joy.
Yeah. But again, there's these are different degrees of suffering. There's like existential dread as we move through life.
Sure.
About like what's because even right now, I mean, there's existential dread with the work that I do. My wife and I are looking into like leaving the country because I've just been targeted because of the work that I've done, and I'm on lists, there's people in Congress who have been who have named me as a dangerous personality, for God's sakes. And so that being the case, there's a certain heaviness to that. I don't want to have to leave, but we'll leave if we have to, and then we'll reinvent ourselves somewhere else. So just even looking at the lineage of your family, persecuted groups, talking about the Jewish experience, then talking about the Black experience, talking about the gay experience, talking about the experience that women endured. These are all different degrees of suffering, but look at those populations just individually. They're also the most reliable sources of truth telling and authentic participation in meaningful existence.
Yeah.
Literally. Those are those are the leaders when it comes to deep philosophy, deep artistic expression, and the tools with which we use to beat back monsters.
Yeah. Well, where does your moral center develop? Is it in childhood, being against the kind of seeing how authority is played out and being like, this authority purports to be moral, but it's obviously not? Or does that come in later in life? Where?
I think I think it comes for everybody early on, in the sense that the younger you are, the more vulnerable you are. And I think that when you're young, you do feel that vulnerability. Of course, there's that moment when it switches to where you feel invincible, and what you're doing is you're sort of testing your space in the world, with all these different things that you want to see how threatening things really are. But very early on, you recognize your vulnerability. You're looking for protection from the people around you who are communicating that with, the language of love, but also the behavior of respect and love. And so in that space, you do your concept of what truth, justice, and love should feel like is formed. And then as you get older, you start to see you're fed the bullshit line that you've got to surrender certain things. You can't be that giving. You can't. There is a place for empathy, but this is a rat race. So you start to figure out how to other people that have the potentiality of robbing you of the things that you should really want. And then you get into the question of just what are we encouraged to really want?
Right.
Success, respect, all of those things. Now, who's drawing the parameters on who's defining that for us? That's when it starts to get really interesting, because it's just what? You want me to go to a job interview and then pretend that I really want this job that I'm interviewing for, that I'm willing to sacrifice everything for your success in your company. I'll sign an NDA, I will remove both my heart and my head as a wage slave for you because I really want it, and look at me. I'm convincing myself that I'm an automaton. Hire me, and people are rewarded by and large for that kind of transformation.
Yeah.
And it's a dehumanizing process. But if you live in a space and you can cultivate this, when you raise your own kids, and if you're lucky enough to have people around you that do this for you when you're a child, you start to realize that's the most important thing is this family that demonstrates love without demanding it.
Yes. There was that. I think this is part and parcel of the contradiction I was talking about before, where it was obvious my parents hated my mom was an English teacher before she retired. And I think she loved the genuine act of teaching. I think she loved that. And I think she obviously loved literature. She loved Shakespeare. She loved Irish poetry. Still does, I assume. But we don't talk about it.
She's now with Al Qaeda, is it what you're supposed to say? She's gotten rid of all of that.
But the teaching in an inner city school and the administration being what it was, she hated that. I mean, I used to be a philosophy professor. I hated academia. I hated all the structures. I love philosophy. I still do. But I did not love the structures of academia enough to I didn't love philosophy enough to deal with that shit, in the sense that I like writing comedy enough that I'll deal with whatever I have to deal with here in Hollywood. Right. My dad, though, absolutely just hated his job. It wasn't doing what he wanted to do. The contradiction between that And knowing that they hated their work or hated aspects of their work, but that they loved their family. And it just felt like I could not get out. Again, I'm pushing my fingers together for Dwayne to illustrate this contradiction that sat inside of me, where I'm just like, wait, so am I supposed to just get a shitty job and I'm just supposed to do it to support I don't even know if I want a family. I don't think I want a family. Yeah. But like, I'm supposed to want one and all that stuff. And I just like, I couldn't understand it until, again, in my 20s.
Yeah.
But you seem to like be cognizant of it at an earlier age.
Well, it's funny, just the way you even describe it. It's through the culture. You know, heroism is sacrificing yourself, you know, for the greater good. And I always thought that wasn't the solution. If the volcano you're throwing yourself into is something that you can actually navigate around, you know, because and it was in the culture as well. I mean, we keep going back, I keep talking about the 1970s and what my family talked about. The thing that formed them was the 1960s, you know, my parents and all. So they brought with them the sensibilities that came from the 1960s. Now, if we look at the 1960s, heroism was not patriotic. It wasn't about sacrifice for the greater good. Blatantly, you think of something like The Graduate, for example. You think about Catch-22. You know, you think about Yossarian, you think about Benjamin Braddock. These are different kinds of heroes, because what they're doing is, well, Benjamin Braddock, he just was afraid of falling into a lifetime of plastic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So he's trying to save himself. And what that started to resonate with, you know, with that generation is just like, I have those same fears and those pains too. You mean I can actually sort of be selfish and do something for myself, and that is heroic as well? So if you can all of a sudden turn it around to where it's just like, okay, I'm doing this because I want to have an authentic life. I've got to figure out a path forward that is going to make my life meaningful, so that I am not a existential burden on people with my pain and agony that I might bring into the world, that I can then say, listen, you fuckers, I've given up my entire life so I can put food on the table. Who wants to live in that atmosphere? I don't want to do that to my offspring.
Right.
And anybody who thinks that that's a version of being selfless and helpful in any way, they've removed themselves from the equation to such an extent that they're dead. And that's no solution to creating a meaningful life by killing yourself. It's a form of suicide.
Yeah. Yeah. So then, do you see examples of moral integrity when you're younger? Do you see injustice in front of you and you're just like, outside of like kind of like the stuff you were talking about, but like maybe I'm thinking of more political kinds of things. I'm just wondering, like, you know, it's real easy for me because I'm just like, my parents taught me about the Holocaust when I was 6 or whatever. And I'm just like, I was fundamentally brought up with the idea that there are unjust things in the world and they can happen and it's not good. And so you should do whatever you can to fight against that stuff.
Yeah, I mean that's all you can really do. I mean, there's a certain element of this that is fatalism. You know, there's a lot of things that are going to happen that I can't prevent and I can't control, and I'm going to be victimized by. I'm going to try to minimize the pain of that suffering, but I can only control what I can control, right? And you know, my brother and I used to sit around in foxholes. We would dig foxholes out behind my house because we would play army a lot. You know, a lot of the fellas in the neighborhood, and we had a great section of wilderness behind my house. And so in downtimes, we would sit in the foxhole and we would genuinely think there was going to be a part of our lives where we were going to be captured by bad people in a war situation, and they were going to torture us for information. And what are we going to do? How are we going to, you know, endure the most extreme tortures that we could conceive of? You know, and that was it's a funny thing to think about, because I remember talking to Tariq Ali, the street fighting man. He's a big British Pakistani guy from the 1960s, hung out with John Lennon a lot. And yeah, he was the Rolling Stones wrote Street Fighting Man after him. He was part of the English London Revolution scene. And so I was interviewing him for a book that I did, and I was telling him this very thing. Just like, yeah, my brother and I, we would sit, and just like, we should learn how to swallow our tongues so, that we don't have to endure the torture of our captors and this and that. And he just looked at me he was just like, what are you Americans doing when you're young? And I'm like, you never played Army and talked about this stuff? He said, no, we were just playing soccer and just trying to live life. But again, I mean, it's just like, so that to me, if we're in a culture where that is presented to young people as a real, genuine possibility, how do you deal with that? My brother and I were ready to sort of like swallow our tongues and sort of and disappear rather than run headlong like John Wayne, into the spray of bullets and die, trying to plant the flag somewhere where it needed to be planted.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, we're right at the end, and I guess the thing that I'm still trying to figure out, like, because I look at other people who kind of like stick to their guns, and I always wonder, well, what is it? Why didn't you compromise? Was it just the feeling of compromise didn't feel good? And so, because that's always been for me, the minute that I like get into a situation where I'm like, this is too much of a compromise for me, morally or aesthetically, I think the two are pretty deeply connected, but
yeah.
I mean, my wife and I have left, there was a project that the first show we sold, it was about race, and they ended up putting like on the production company, like the producer was like this old white guy, and we found him, my wife's black, so this makes sense. We found him rewriting her monologue from his point of view almost. And we were just like, what the fuck is going on here? And we eventually just left the project. We're like, this is like, we're not going to get to do we're not going to get to say the things. And Naomi's like, I'm not going to say this stuff. This is not like what, it was insane. But there are plenty of people we see who are just like, yeah, I'll live with this. I'll live with this moral compromise. I think it deforms you as a human being eventually, but I mean,
100%. And that was my experience when I moved to California too, because of course I was out there. So I'm like, okay, my stuff was being published. I was doing a lot of writing for the LA Weekly, and my stuff was appearing in all magazines and newspapers and so forth. So inevitably, I was asked by different production companies to, hey, what would a Mr. Fish TV show look like? And so I developed a ton. I still have. I've got like 20 shows. And go into the pitch meetings and stuff, and you can see the faces. First, I would even make reels, and I would show the reels for animated projects, and they would laugh and laugh and laugh. But this is great, because it's just like chums, the chummy aspect. And then all of a sudden, sort of the business sensibility would kick in. And it's just like, well, let's see this again. Let's watch it again. And I remember that experience where rewatching things with these people who were eventually going to have to sell it to marketing somehow, looking at it and just being like, all of a sudden, not laughing anymore. They've been laughing, but then it's just like, all right, that's got to go. Saying stuff like that. And again, it's just like, no, I'm not making a product. This is not about the commodification of useful ideas. Useful ideas are their own thing, And so now I'm to the point where, I pitched a bunch of shows, probably now the last time I did it seriously was probably 3 or 4 years ago, although I pitched something a couple months ago, but I think people looked me up and they were just like, we don't want this riffraff involved in anything in Hollywood. But now, I had something that I think is a really super thrilling idea to me, which I'm not going to share because somebody will steal it. I know you people out in Hollywood. But now I'm doing it as a graphic novel, because the idea was just like, okay, all of your fears about what this really is about, I'm going to allay that by just proof of concept. Here it is. Now it's completely rendered. And now get to what you have to deal with. I can't sell it to you so that you can now build a team around it. This is for me. I'm the Orson Welles of this, and you're going to listen to me, people. But I think that that's part of the thing that Hollywood really bothered me about, because I do know some writers who were really good writers for their own projects, like, this is what I really want this to be. Moving to California, and then all of a sudden needing to share it and figure out where the compromises were. And I'm sure that you know these people. You might even be one of them who has sold something that has gotten rewritten so many times and rejiggered. You just said you guys walked away from a project where it's just like, make sure my name is nowhere near this thing, right? Art is too important to me as my personal expression to treat it like that, to mistreat it like that. It drives my wife crazy that I've never been edited really. Everything that I do is just like, this is a Mr. Fish product. Here, do you want the Mr. Fish product? And people are like, great. This is, and now if there's any pushback against it, now they can just say, hey, it wasn't me, it was this jackass.
Yeah. But like, was there, it doesn't have to be like an incident or something like that, but like, this is even before, like, say, even moving out here or something like that. I'm just curious, like, was there a time where like you started to like, you had to compromise, or there was someone who was asking you to, and you recognized that it was bad, or you did, and you like in the moment? Because I think I've always had this kind of like sense, this instinct, and this feeling like the minute that I run up against like bullshit or moral assholes or something like that, where like it just feels bad, and I kind of just naturally push away from it.
Yeah. That's a good instinct. You're trying to keep a white-knuckled grip on your soul. That's a really important thing to keep doing.
Exactly. It's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, was it like that for you, or did you have to like learn the lessons?
I no. And the reason is because all of my first cartoons got published very early on in a newspaper called Anarchy Newspaper. That's where I found Chomsky. Chomsky was all through that thing. And so, of course, there's not an editor at Anarchy that is just like, can we tone this down?
So you started off not having to make any compromises in the first place. So you're just like, well, this is just, and this fits. Tell me if this is true or not. This fits the stuff that I grew up with, the way that I exist in the world already. So it feels right in the first place.
Yeah. Exactly. And it also seemed to echo the people who inspired me. Like all of the artists that really inspired me, they all seemed like outlaws to me. Like listening to Coltrane, all of that is pure Coltrane. That adventurism and that fearlessness, that's not like, how can I sell a record? That's the last thing that these people were thinking about. I read, Kerouac early on. It's the same thing. It was just like, oh my gosh, this guy is, this is just pure Kerouac. This is just a pure mind at work who people are getting out of the way of. Lenny Bruce, John Lennon, you can see where, his compromises, the Beatles, with the Jesus quote and everything, all of that stuff. You could see that wrestling. But the real power of John Lennon was just the fact that when he was pure, he was pure, And so all of that to me is what art was supposed to be. That it was not a commercial activity. It was something, it was very personal and could be weaponized in such a way to demonstrate pure, unadulterated truth telling. And that's thrilling to me. And that's super exciting to me. And there's any compromise of that just feels just the same to you, where it's just like, this is disgusting. This is kind of disgusting. And it doesn't look like me. I want, when I talk to somebody, like I'm talking to you, there's not anything in the back of my mind where I'm just like, well, then I'll say this and I'll paint myself as da-da-da, all of that sort of nonsense. It's really just about just like, okay, this is how I am at this moment. This is what I'm going to communicate. It's fine. I'll forgive myself if I wasn't as smart or interesting as maybe you would want me to be, or that upon reflection, I wished that I was. All of those impulses and reflexes I've sort of worked out of my brain because it's not worth it. I can only do the best that I can do in the moment that I'm in,
That's that's something I aspire to. So, Dwayne, thank you so much for joining me. This has been an absolute delight.
Hey, anytime. No, thanks. I appreciate it. It was good to have such a freewheeling conversation.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye.